What's up, Gwen? That's awesome. Are you originally from the United States or you are born and raised in France? Let me know. Okay, so first off, let's deal with why we're here in the first place. Juneteenth is now a national holiday. That happened in 2021. President Joe Biden signed the law making Juneteenth a national holiday, and it's really momentous because it's the first new national holiday since 1983. Does anybody know which holiday became a national holiday in 1983? If you said MLK Day, you are correct. MLK Day became a national holiday in 1983, and this is the first new one since then. So I've been saying for years now that Juneteenth should be a national holiday. I think that's for a few reasons. Number one, it is because simply as a fact of history, the emancipation of enslaved Black people in the United States is one of the most important events in our nation's history. Um, so, for that reason alone, we should be remembering it on an annual basis at least. There are some other reasons too. Number one, it is actually a time for the nation to celebrate freedom, to celebrate progress. There's very few events in our nation's history that we can just sort of freely acknowledge was a good thing and a step in the right direction. And certainly emancipation would be one of those things. So it's an opportunity to celebrate progress that we've made. It's also important that Juneteenth is a national holiday because it acknowledges that we still have a long, long way to go before people are truly free, and specifically, Black people are truly free. So, for those reasons, I think it's a good thing that Juneteenth has become a national holiday. But there are some risks, if you will, some drawbacks, some things to look out for. So, firstly, I think we need to acknowledge that we are really good at celebrating the wins and not at all very good as a nation at looking at the harm and the wrongs done in the past, particularly to Black people. So, my concern with making Juneteenth a national holiday is that we would jump right to the emancipation part. We would jump right to the freedom part. And we would skip over the reason why we needed emancipation in the first place. That we skip over the reason why we need a Juneteenth in the first place. That is to say that we wouldn't look at racism and white supremacy and race-based chattel slavery as the evils that they are. And we would simply say, yeah, that stuff was bad, but hey, we got it right. So let's celebrate. I think that's a risk here too. The other risk is that Juneteenth would not remain a Black-centered holiday. As more and more people get a hold of this holiday, if you will, as we celebrate it nationally, then you run the risk of people decentering Black people and Black experiences. And the reality is, Juneteenth is primarily about Black people. Some people's hair is on fire at this moment as they hurl claims of reverse racism. No, this is about emancipation from race based chattel slavery, under which people of African descent, also known as Black people, were enslaved. So when we say emancipation, we've got to say emancipation from what and for whom? And it's Black emancipation. So, y'all, it is okay to be specific. Every racial and ethnic group has their own unique and important history, their own unique and significant history. But Juneteenth is a time to recognize the history and experiences of Black people in particular and specifically. Can we be okay with that? We have to be if we want to recognize Juneteenth appropriately. It has to remain Black centered. But I say Black centered does not mean Black exclusive, in the sense that you can be Black centered and people of other races and ethnicities can learn from, support, and even participate in certain ways. And we'll talk about what it looks like to participate, particularly as a white person, on Juneteenth. So those are a few of the reasons why I think it's important that we celebrate and commemorate Juneteenth as a national holiday. Also, a few of the reasons why we should be cautious now that it has become a national holiday. So for the rest of our time, I want to do a couple of things. I'm really eager to look into the history of Juneteenth, particularly what happened on that fateful day, June 19th. And then I want to sort of break down some of that history and what it means, what the significance is, even for us in the present day. Before I dive into that, I would love for you to support this work of historical exploration, this work of racial and historical truth telling. And so I want to drop in a few links for you. Certainly, I would encourage you, if you're not already, follow me online. So I'm on both Twitter and Instagram at Jemar Tisby. I would love to see some new follows here. And then as well, my main outlet these days is my Substack newsletter. So that's just jamartisby.substack.com. And I'll drop that in there. And so that's all my latest writings. I'm posting there multiple times a week. You can subscribe as a free subscriber and just get it emailed to you, or you can become a paid subscriber for just $7 a month. You can support me and my work. If you're interested in my books, you can go to my website, jamartisby.com/books, or just jamartisby.com, and you can find it. And then lastly, if you'd like to book me to speak at your organization, your church, your university, I'd love to see if I can try to come to visit. And I dropped the link to that in the chat as well. So if you have any other questions about how to contact me, let me know. I'm also on Facebook. You can follow my page there. So those are some of the preliminaries. Again, this is the beginning of a conversation. So I would love to see you more frequently online with me in these various channels. So we're going to dive into the history. Then we're going to dive into some of the practical aspects about how to celebrate or commemorate Juneteenth. And then I will leave it open for questions. So along the way, if you have questions, please feel to drop it in there. But I'll also queue you up when we get closer. So let's talk about the history of Juneteenth. By now, I hope most people realize that Juneteenth is a mashup of the words June and 19th, and it stands for that day in 1865 when enslaved Black people in Texas first learned of their freedom. Now, mind you, this is 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on January 1st, 1863. It's about 2 months after General Robert E. Lee surrendered at the courthouse at Appomattox, Virginia. And so the war was all but over. Why did it take so long for people in Texas to learn about it? Well, 2 reasons. One, at that time, Texas was about as far west as you got in the United States or with the Union, right? So it took a while for word to travel that far. But another factor is there were folks who didn't want enslaved Black people to learn about their emancipation. You got to realize there was no Twitter, there was no internet, there was no way for enslaved Black people in Texas to learn of their emancipation unless people who wanted them to know about it told them. In fact, Texas was the place where some plantation owners and enslavers, they fled west to Texas in order to escape where the heavy fighting was in the Southeast and continue their slaveholding practices and economic system. So they had no interest in letting enslaved people know of their emancipation. So that's part of why it took so long. And then what happened on that fateful day was Major General Gordon Granger was a white Union Army officer, and with the Union, they announced emancipation. So he went to actually several different cities that day, but most often we associate it with Galveston, Texas, and announced the emancipation of enslaved Black people. And I want to look at that announcement carefully. Most people sort of just stop there and talk about the announcement. Do you know what the announcement said? Do you know what the announcement said? Here's what it said. Wait a minute, I had it right here. Sorry, here we go. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness, either there or elsewhere. Let's break down a little of what we heard. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation, meaning the Emancipation Proclamation issued years prior, the proclamation from the executive of the United States, meaning the president, who at that time was Abraham Lincoln, soon to be assassinated, all slaves are free. Can you imagine how enslaved people in Texas and really all over the country, how they would have heard that? What would their response have been to an official from the Union Army announcing in a formal letter, all slaves are free? I can't imagine the relief, the joy, maybe even the disbelief. Like, could this be real? Is this really happening? Mind you, by 1865, there'd been 4 years of war. Looked often like the Confederacy would win, would get to keep their plantations and their enslaved labor. And now, finally, the good news, all slaves are free. So you can understand why Juneteenth is the oldest celebration of Black emancipation in this country. Of course, Black people would celebrate. Granger goes on to say, this involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. Now, this absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property is critical because obviously Black people, enslaved Black people, had no personal rights that anyone had to respect. They didn't even often get formally married because plantation owners and enslavers didn't care to do that. There may have been some ceremony, but it was informal and oftentimes didn't have legal weight in the judicial system. So they had personal rights and they also had rights of property. Now, this is monumental. It said that freedmen, as they were called, recently freed Black women, men, and children, they had an absolute equality of rights of property. This is monumental because prior to emancipation, Black people were themselves considered property. So, of course, if you are property, you can't own property. That's what the chattel in race-based chattel slavery means. It means you were considered an object. You were not a person, you were property. You're not a human being, you were a tool, a farm implement. So, of course, you didn't have personal rights, nor could you own property. And then it goes on, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor, which is a switch again. no longer slave and slave master, no longer enslaved and enslaver, but an employee and an employer, which obviously means you have to be paid. And that's the big part here. I'll talk about in a moment, but Black people were not paid, were not compensated for their labor. Only the barest minimum was offered to keep them functioning and profitable. Now it's saying you can't do that. You got to pay your laborers. The order goes on to say the freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. So perhaps they had in mind a couple of things. One, they didn't want Black people to go party in the streets, which, come on, we deserve a party, right? In the wake of this Emancipation Proclamation, like, give us some time to celebrate. But I think more to the point, they were concerned, and rightfully so, about Black people fleeing the South in droves. Now that Black people were free from slavery, it would be understandable, even predictable, that many formerly enslaved people would leave the land of their enslavement. Indeed, that happened, but it took a little while. The Great Migration didn't start until the first quarter of the 20th century, and millions upon millions of Black people did leave, but that wasn't right away. In fact, going back to the personal rights and personal property, a lot of Black people wanted to stay and be farmers, wanted to have their own plot of land, wanted to have 40 acres and a mule, so to speak. And then the last line I think is very telling. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. So aside from fleeing the South to other parts of the country, all throughout the Civil War, Black people ran away from the plantation and were just trying to get to Union lines. They thought and believed that if they made it to the Union, then they would be free. And indeed, they were sort of, not legally in every case, but they weren't sent back by and large. Many of the Black people who fled to Union forces started fighting for the Union and became soldiers and literally fought for their own freedom. Many others were put to work doing menial labor, whether cooking or building fortifications or cleaning or whatever. But many times they would not be allowed to attain a high rank or lead white people. So even though the Union was fighting against the Confederacy, that by no means meant that white Union soldiers, particularly the leaders, were any sort of racial egalitarians. And then I think another aspect of this line, they won't be allowed to collect, meaning gather at military posts, and they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. There was a myth going around, especially among white Southerners, that if you emancipated Black people, they would be lazy. Black people wouldn't work unless they were forced to work as slave laborers, is what many people believed. And they said, as soon as you take that system away, you're going to have 3 million Black people just lounging around doing nothing. Which, if you pause to think about it, is absolutely mind-boggling. That the Black people who labored from sunup to sundown, who built the wealth of this nation and on their own time hired out their labor so they could accumulate savings so they could buy their own relatives out of slavery, who under great risk and duress to themselves tried to figure out how to read and write, who under great risk and duress to themselves, after a long day of enslaved laboring, would go out and find ways to worship, either in secret in a cabin or sneak out to the woods, to the hush arbors, to the people who worked and then on top of work tried to build lives for themselves. You think those people are going to be idle? You think that group of people isn't going to want to work? And you hear echoes of this to this day, don't you? That Black people just want to live off welfare and don't want to work. This is where the trope of the welfare queen comes in in Reagan's presidential campaigns in the 1980s. This is where all of these ideas about the quote unquote deserving poor, some of that comes from. You know, you only deserve assistance if you're willing to work for yourself, which can easily be connected to a myth of Black laziness. So even in the announcement of emancipation, even in the announcement of absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property, there are these tinges of anti-Blackness. So I just wanted to go through some of that history with you because I think it's really important that we understand the historical context there. And there's more history. So um, there's over a century of Black people practicing Juneteenth and coming up with traditions. Oftentimes, Juneteenth the celebration would be held on church grounds because quickly after emancipation, which by the way, these proclamations did not abolish slavery. That wasn't until Congress voted on the 13th Amendment. By the way, isn't it interesting? They call that group of Congress people the radical Republicans. Now, don't get caught up in the partisan name, because back then the platforms were switched, and the Republicans were the party of emancipation, and the Democrats were the party of racial regression, right? So, but the point being, radical. And right now, you have people on the far right calling others the radical left. So this stuff isn't new. People on the other side of the aisle were calling folks who wanted racial progress radical then, just as they do now. But one of the other things that I think is important as we talk about Juneteenth, as we celebrate emancipation, even with the perhaps imperfect General Order number 3 that was read to enslaved people, one of the things we have to do is recognize the ugliness of slavery. I mentioned at the beginning, I'm concerned that we would move way too quickly toward emancipation, way too quickly toward celebration, way too quickly to celebrate progress without deeply understanding why we needed the progress in the first place. I'm going to read you a quote from James Baldwin. It was a speech he gave at Columbia University. And he said, "It is worthwhile to point out that for most Americans, slavery is quite remote. And America herself would really prefer that we remained dispassionate about it. Well, I, for one, will never be dispassionate about slavery or any other unforgivable atrocity committed against humanity." And it's in that spirit that I share with you 3 short examples of life under slavery. And I uh, give a trigger warning here. There's some graphic descriptions. So if you have young people listening, or you're not in a head place or an emotional place to hear it, that's a heads up for you. I wrote in my first book, The Color of Compromise, about a man named Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa. He wrote an autobiography, and that's why we know of him today. He was born in Africa. He was of the Igbo tribe of present-day Nigeria, and he and his sister were kidnapped while they were kids. What's very interesting and important about Equiano's narrative is that he talks about the experience of being on the slave ship. So he's born about 1745. He's kidnapped when he's around 11 years old. And here's how he describes being on the slave ship. And this is actually even before they set sail. He said, "The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any amount of time." Then he told about being on board the ships while they were at sea, and talks about, well, you know, human beings have bodily functions and that waste has to go somewhere. So here's how he described it. There were these tubs which held human excrement, quote, "into which the children often fell." and were almost suffocated. And that's just the trip getting there. One of the things that Equiano also talks about is family separation. So, like I said, he and his sister were kidnapped. They were the only people they knew or had a connection to, because we forget there's great diversity among Africans. So there would be people of other tribes who didn't speak the same language, didn't know each other, weren't family, weren't friends, may have even been enemies. And now you're all lumped together in this ship, and whatever differences there were are flattened out and erased because now you're all enslaved. So you can imagine how important it would be in that situation to have someone who's familiar and a family member, a sibling near you. Well, it didn't stay that way for long. They were separated. They got back together just for one day. And here's how Equiano described it. Scarcely had the fatal morning appeared when she was again torn from me forever. I was now more miserable, if possible, than before. I think it's also important to note that Equiano was a Christian. He recognized the hypocrisy of Christians who said they followed Jesus, but would rip people from their homeland, enslave them, and then rip apart the scant family relations they still had. So he said to them, he said to his readers, "O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God, who says unto you, do unto all men as you would men should do unto you?" Basically saying, the Bible tells us, love your neighbor as yourself. So where are you getting this behavior? How are you doing this to other human beings? The ugliness of slavery. Let me give you another example. This was in the book too. Harriet Jacobs was born into slavery. And one of the things that we have to recognize is that, as precarious as it was simply to be Black in a white supremacist and a slavery society, it was even more precarious to be Black and a woman. So Harriet Jacobs talks about growing up under the leering eye of her enslaver, this white man who was essentially just waiting for her to get old enough. And Jacobs also talks about being raised by her grandmother. Jacobs was an orphan, so her grandmother raised her, and grandmother was a devout Christian, was concerned obviously about her granddaughter's safety, but also about her, how she understood her Christian purity and virtue. And so it was this constant thing on her mind, Harriet Jacobs, and she had this awful choice. She could be sexually assaulted by her enslaver, or she could voluntarily enter into a relationship with a white man who was free, was not on their plantation, a white man. And in the end, she chose to enter into a relationship with this white man because she figured if she had children by her enslaver, they would automatically be enslaved. If she had children by this white man, he might have mercy and not enslave his own children, even though they were mixed race. And so that's what happened. She chose that choice. But here's one of the things we have to understand: oppression limits your choices. Oppression limits your good options. So there's no sense in which she really had her preference. She chose the least of two very, very bad options because that's all she had as an enslaved person. Here's what she wrote. She also wrote a memoir and autobiography. That's why we know. And she was very aware, I think, not just of the reader's gaze, but of the white gaze, and not just of the white gaze, of the white woman's gaze. And we don't have time to go into all of it, but of course, white womanhood was weaponized against both white women, but white or Black people and Black women in particular. And so she was very conscious that white women might be reading about her story and her choices and sort of look down their noses. at Harriet Jacobs. So she said this: "But oh, ye happy women, whose purity has been sheltered from childhood, who have been free to choose the objects of your affection, whose homes are protected by law. Do not judge the poor, desolate slave girl too severely." Jacobs was saying, listen, you've lived a sheltered existence. Your womanhood is defended unto the death, especially when people falsely accuse Black men of assaulting white women. Your homes, your sanctity is protected by law. Harriet Jacobs had no such protection. So she said, don't judge. Don't judge me. You don't know what it's like to be vulnerable in these ways. One more example will suffice for now as we talk about the ugliness of slavery and why we needed emancipation in the first place. This one comes from Frederick Douglass and one of his autobiographies. He speaks of the violence of slavery. And again, this is graphic, but not gratuitously so. It's simply the reality that I think we have to understand if we're going to properly appreciate Juneteenth. So he speaks of a particularly cruel enslaver named Captain Anthony, who seemed to take joy in whipping his helpless victims. This is how Frederick Douglass explained it. He said, he, Captain Anthony, would at times seem to take great pleasure in whipping a slave. I have often been awakened at the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an own aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up to a joist and whip upon her naked back till she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victim seemed to move his iron heart from its bloody purpose. And the louder she screamed, the harder he whipped, and where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped the longest. He would whip her to make her scream, and whip her to make her hush, and not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. Douglass goes on and says, I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I well remember it. I never shall forget it whilst I remember anything. Not only imagining this happening at all, but imagining a child witnessing it. What that would have done to the psyche of a young Frederick Douglass or any young Black child to see their own relative tortured, have it be commonplace, and have there be no recourse through the courts of law. You'll sometimes hear that there were, Black people were happy under slavery. Like literally people said this, not just in the past, but even in the present, they'll intimate that slavery wasn't so bad. Black people were busy being productive. They had clothes on their backs. They were safe while on the plantation. Like wild stuff, y'all. I'm not making it up. People really, to this day, try to minimize the horrors of slavery. And what I've given you is just a taste, but it should be enough to disabuse us of any idea that race-based chattel slavery in the United States there was anything good in it. That life under slavery was any way beneficial. And I think if we're going to remember Juneteenth properly, we also have to remember slavery, especially white people. Many times you've learned the least about it overall, even just in formal settings like school, but also it's a history that was deliberately hidden, downplayed, underplayed. So it behooves us to learn about the reality under slavery. It also gives us an appreciation for the importance of Juneteenth. If that's your reality, and for many generations of Black people, there was no end in sight. They had no idea a civil war was coming. If that's your reality, then of course you're going to celebrate changing that reality and actually having freedom and liberty and equality for all. Hopefully, that was the idea. So, we've learned about the history of Juneteenth. We've learned about some of the reality of slavery. Let's talk about how to commemorate Juneteenth. And I want to talk about commemorating versus celebrating. Commemorating versus celebrating. Now, mind you, I want to remind you, please ask questions in the comments here. If you wanted to, you could send a quick message out, link to this live stream, and let folks know that we are still gathering and still meeting, and they have time to join us here if you think this is stuff that people should know about. So I dropped the link in there if you want to share it. So let's talk about commemorating versus celebrating. That's how I put it. I don't know if anybody else uses that language, but I keep trying to remind myself that what I'm about to say should not be at all controversial. What I'm about to say should be self evident. And if people struggle with it, that's more a sign of how poorly we have educated people about slavery and racism than it is about the actual offensiveness of the comment. And the comment is this: Black and white people should recognize Juneteenth differently because Black and white people were affected by Juneteenth differently. Because Black and white people were affected by slavery differently. Thank you, Gwen. I'll get to that question on the flag behind me. It was Black people who were enslaved. So when word of emancipation comes, Black people are going to react and respond to it differently than white people who, as a class, as a group of people, were the enslavers. Do you realize that what race-based means in race-based chattel slavery means, by definition, Black people could be slaves? Really, by default, they were slaves, and in exceptional and rare cases, they were not. I should say enslaved. Northern states abolished slavery long years before the Civil War, of course, but what that was doing was changing the default. And the default was that according to this construct called race, if you were Black, you were eligible to be enslaved. And then by definition, if you were not eligible for slavery. Doesn't mean you weren't couldn't be economically exploited, doesn't mean you weren't poor, doesn't mean you didn't work hard. It just means that categorically, literally according to this category of race, you were not considered enslaved. But Black people were. So that's different, is all I'm saying. So the ways that we recognize Juneteenth ought to be different across racial lines. And now for people who are not Black or not white, for people of other races and ethnicities, it should be an opportunity to appreciate as well. Because Black progress is progress for everyone. And the Black freedom struggle has helped pave the way for other freedom struggles, for other people groups, right? So all of us are in this. Now, I say celebrate versus commemorate. Black people should celebrate Juneteenth. We should be throwing parties, block parties, music, food, family, friends, all of that. And it should be a day off for us. Here's my perhaps somewhat countercultural opinion on these things is for many of these holidays, Black History Month, MLK Day, you name it, for Black people, these are days on, not days off. And I get the notion of behind days on, right? Like let's continue the work of racial justice. I get that. But many Black people, we're just living this reality every darn day, and we tired. So can we take Juneteenth as an opportunity to actually rest? To actually take a day off on the day off. It is, after all, a federal holiday. So we get a day off. So let's actually take the day off. Let's do the things that refresh us and rejuvenate us. And I'm not laying down some blanket law for anyone. I'm just saying we do have that opportunity not to do more just because it's a holiday about Black people. White folks, I think, the appropriate terminology would be commemorate. Now, don't get me wrong, all of us, Black and white and every race and ethnicity, should celebrate emancipation from slavery. That's a good thing. That is a good thing. That we said, hey, this ain't right. Went to war over it. Passed a constitutional amendment to abolish it. That is a good thing, and we can all celebrate that. But white people can commemorate it because white people have to recognize the historic role that they played in enslaving people. Again, let's have a nuanced conversation. I'm not saying you yourself enslave people. I'm not even saying that in your family history you enslave people. I am saying that in a race-based chattel slavery, white people had, at minimum, the advantage of not being in the class of people who could be enslaved. But let's just be honest. In some of your families, there were people who enslaved others or benefited from it in some meaningful way. Let's be real. Some of these institutions, including churches, some churches have, I didn't know this really till somewhat recently. Some churches have multi-million-dollar endowments. They don't really need to live off of tithes and offerings. They have an endowment that generates interest that, funds a lot of their budget. And I didn't even know churches could do that. But there are some historic churches and denominations that have connections to slavery and had wealthy members that allow them to have that kind of wealth. That's just the reality. We have colleges and universities that were founded as Christian institutions, now finally acknowledging their historic connections to slavery. You can think of places like Georgetown and Princeton Seminary, and even Harvard has launched a massive initiative. Those are just a few. When I was in grad school at the University of Mississippi, I was part of our campus's group of a consortium across the country called Universities Studying Slavery. And it was designed to study the institutional history and the connection to slavery at these colleges and universities. So all I'm saying is commemorate. So for white people, it would be a wonderful time, if you're Christian, to have a service of lament, to grieve over racism and white supremacy and slavery and the historic role that white people have played in the oppression of people of African descent and others. Yes, celebrate progress, but also recognize it's different. It's different. The flag behind me, and then I'm going to get to some concrete ways and we'll ask questions and wrap up. The flag behind me is the Juneteenth flag. It's relatively new. It was first designed in 1997, then revised in the year 2000. The symbolism on it is powerful. So the star in the middle represents the Lone Star State, which is an emblem of Texas, where Juneteenth originated. Also is said to represent just every state in terms of each state is represented by a star on the US flag. The sort of star burst around it is a nova, N-O-V-A, which in astronomy heralds the birth of a new star. And so it's the new beginning, new birth for people of African descent. Then you see the line isn't a straight line, it's a curved line, and that's supposed to represent the horizon. And it's a new horizon for Black people now that they've been freed from slavery. And then, of course, the red, the white, and the blue also harken to the US flag. And it makes a very powerful statement that Black people are Americans too. That Black people have just as much rights, just as much responsibilities as anyone else, as namely white people in this country. That Black people are true Americans, over and against people who would say Black people don't have rights as citizens, as Americans. So yeah, that's the Juneteenth flag. I think you can order it online a bunch of places. It would be great to have for next Juneteenth, but I wanted to make sure that it was my backdrop for this conversation. I preached a sermon earlier on Juneteenth, and freedom was the theme. And I characterized, freedom can be a lot of things. It can mean a lot of things. It can be opportunity, it can be choice, it can be financial freedom, physical freedom. All of those things are true. I emphasized freedom as rest, freedom as the ability to rest. And for so many Black people, it feels like we cannot rest because we are always on. We are always fighting against racism. We are always battling for justice. And for white people, it could be, what can I do to support Black people getting the rest they deserve, but are so often denied? What can I do to support Black people getting the rest they deserve, but are so often denied? That could be helping to pay for a retreat for Black folks to get together and not produce anything, not be on social media or anything, just to relax, just to rejuvenate among community. You got a lake house or beach house somewhere, offer it up to some folks for refreshing. For Black people, it could mean, Venmo or Cash App them some cash, and don't make it weird and be like, oh, you're Black, you must be poor. Here's $20. That's reparations. No, 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 no. Just happy Juneteenth. Have a meal, go to a movie, get folks a gift card to their favorite restaurant or for some food delivery service, right? Rest, rest, rest. Don't let's add more labor onto Black people to explain racism or explain our existence. For Black people, really, really, really do celebrate. I mean, there's so few occasions where we as Black folks really take the opportunity to celebrate. I think the Black church has done pretty well at this, actually, from graduations to, um, honors and accolades to weddings and homegoings and all of that. But we as a people, because we face so much hardship still due to racism, should really take the opportunity of Juneteenth to celebrate in whatever way that looks like for you. I hope next year on the actual day of Juneteenth, not to be doing anything and pre-record or whatever material I need to, but so I can actually take the day off and rest. So we've looked at the history of Juneteenth. We've looked at some ways to commemorate or celebrate Juneteenth. We've talked about the symbolism of the flag here. Is there anything else you'd like to know? Let me know in your questions here. As you're getting those together, I'm going to pull up some questions I got on social media already. So one person asked, will a recording of this be available? Yes, this will stay on my YouTube live. I will also post it, a link to it on my newsletter at jamartisby.substack.com. By the way, if you want a concrete way to support Black people, that's one way you can do it. Sign up for that newsletter. Someone said advice for white parents of Black children, toddlers in their case, to celebrate as a family. So certainly explain the reason for Juneteenth in an age-appropriate way as best you can. But overall, with kids that young, make it fun. I would want young people to have young Black kids to have a positive connotation around Juneteenth. Like it's something they look forward to every year. It is, after all, a holiday. So what are the ways? Maybe you go to a water park or you visit with family and friends. You do one of their favorite activities. Like make it fun, and you can layer on the history and the meaning and the significance of Juneteenth as they get older. Don't deny what it is, right? But in an age appropriate way, tell them, but then make it fun. Um, are there any other appropriate ways for white people to celebrate it outside of donating money and continuing to educate ourselves and our kids? Should we attend celebrations? Short answer is if you're invited, go. I think if an event is open to the public that organizers know and are willing to welcome people of other races and ethnicities. So if it's something that the city is putting on, if it's, a block party or something where the public is invited, I think you can go, but go as you would almost like if you're a white person visiting a black church, you're going to participate, to support, to be in solidarity with, to join in with, but not to take over. So it's a humility thing. So if they don't have the food that you're used to, or the music that you're used to, or the clothing that you're used to, that's okay. You're going to be all right. Go into it with an attitude of humility. You're there to take part in, but not to take over. And if it's an open and public event, then I would expect that the organizers realize that could happen. Now, there are other events that might be a church function or a family function or a neighborhood function where it might be odd for you simply to show up unless you have an invitation. So be aware of that. When in doubt, you can always ask. Contact the organizer, be like, hey, I really want to support. Would it be appropriate for me to attend? Would it be appropriate for me to attend with my family? Those kinds of things. Ask. Another question. Is it appropriate/appreciated for non-Black people to wish Black friends happy Juneteenth? Not wishing seems like ignoring it, but wishing it seems trite. I think there's probably different opinions among Black people. For me, I get it. I would give white folks the benefit of the doubt if they said happy Juneteenth to me. I would think they weren't trying to be malicious or paternalistic. It does beg the question, are you in this racial justice stuff for real, or are you just caught up in a moment of a holiday and saying happy Juneteenth? If you want to say it, at the very least, you should know what slavery was about and what Juneteenth is about. And by and large, you should be committed to the work of racial justice on an ongoing basis and not just an annual basis. I think that's a big thing that Juneteenth will help us remind ourselves of, is that fighting racism needs to be an ongoing thing, not an annual thing, not just an annual thing. So I think you can say happy Juneteenth, depending on, do you know the person, whatever. If you don't say it, Black, they might think you're ignoring it, but I think you'll be okay. We have a question on here that says white churches, Christians, communities, etc., don't seem to know how to lament. Do you have any recommendations for books, sermons, liturgies that could teach us how? Of course, the go-to book is Soong-Chan Ra's Prophetic Lament. Soong-Chan Ra's Prophetic Lament. That is a great resource. The Bible actually has quite a bit on lament. There's an entire book called Lamentations. I've heard of some churches doing almost a litany of the saints. I think for Juneteenth, so in the context that I've seen it, it's Black people who have died, been killed because of police brutality. I think in the context of Juneteenth, it could be celebrating, Black freedom fighters. It could be celebrating those who have moved us forward in the struggle for racial justice. Those names could be read in a church service, let's say. Certainly song selection would be a big part of it. Songs by Black artists, songs that speak to liberation. And the Black church has incredible resources on lamentation. Even today, when 9 people are massacred in Buffalo, we can look at how those churches and faith communities commemorated their lives to understand what lamentations look like. But some of that work is going to be for white Christians, certainly, to figure out. Yeah, great question. Anything else, y'all? Again, I would encourage you, sign up for my Substack at jamartisby.substack.com. I'm also all over social media. So if you want to continue the conversation, we can keep it going that way. I really appreciate you for tuning in to this Juneteenth teach-in. This video will be available, so feel free to share it far and wide with folks who you think would be interested and folks who you think probably need to hear more of this. I am grateful for your support. I'm grateful that Juneteenth is a national holiday, and I'm glad that we get to remember the significance of our freedom, especially for those to whom freedom was denied for so long. Have a great day.